The forest of the Ardennes was buried under snow, white, silent, endless. Trees sagged beneath their frozen weight, and the only sound was the distant groan of engines somewhere beyond the mist. It was December 1944, and the world had turned to ice and steel. In that frozen labyrinth, among the shattered villages and twisting roads, something enormous was moving. Civilians whispered about black giants rolling through the valleys, tanks so huge that the ground itself trembled beneath them. Soldiers who glimpsed them from afar swore the snow cracked under their weight. It wasn't myth. It was the newest creation of Hitler's engineers, the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Ausf B. The Allies would give it a simpler name, the King Tiger. To the men who built it, the Tiger II was not just a tank, it was a statement. Armor thicker than any shell could pierce, a gun that could kill an American Sherman from 2 miles away, 70 tons of iron arrogance wrapped around an 88mm cannon. The Reich promised it would restore German dominance, sweep aside. But in the frozen stillness, each Tiger II was a nightmare of complexity. Its Maybach HL-230 engine strained under the weight. Its gearbox howled in protest every time a driver shifted gears. The men who commanded these monsters knew their power and their fragility. In theory, nothing on the battlefield could touch them. In practice, snow, mud, and physics were far deadlier enemies than any gun. From the small Belgian town of Stavelot to the ridges above La Glaise, Joachim Peiper's elite 1st SS Panzer Regiment led the spearhead of Hitler's counterattack. His column, a mix of Panthers, half-tracks, and a handful of King Tigers, pushed west through narrow roads and mountain passes, the engines echoing like thunder through the valleys. Peiper's orders were simple and impossible: break through to the Meuse River, split the Allied lines, and reach the armor. The King Tigers were supposed to be unstoppable. Their commanders believed it, their crews believed it, even their enemies believed it. American tankers spoke of them in the same tone they used for nightmares. Tigers, whispered like a curse over campfires. On December 17th, one of these monsters rolled through the village of La Glaise, its treads grinding over cobblestones, its turret turning like the slow head of a predator. Children hid behind walls, watching as black-uniformed SS tankers stared ahead with frozen expressions. The tank's long 88mm gun caught the morning light like a blade. Behind it, the snow churned to mud. Inside the vehicle, the air was suffocating, heat from the engine mixing with breath and oil. Corporal Hans Raymond, the gunner, wiped frost from his periscope. "She's purring," he said. The driver laughed bitterly. For now. They both knew the truth. The King Tiger was as dangerous to its crew as to its enemies. It burned through fuel faster than they could carry it, broke bridges under its own mass, and overheated in minutes if pushed too hard. But no one dared speak it out loud. As the column advanced, the snow thickened into a blizzard. The narrow Ardennes roads became death traps, hairpin turns between forests and ravines, bridges barely strong enough for a horse cart. The King Tigers crushed them one by one. Behind every crossing lay wreckage, splintered beams, twisted steel, black ice streaked with fuel. The German advance slowed to a crawl. High above in reconnaissance planes, American observers saw something strange. Dozens of tanks crawling like beetles through the snow, yet moving slower and slower each hour. "They're too heavy," one pilot radioed back. "They're breaking their own roads." By nightfall, Peiper's force had advanced barely 10 miles. Every engine was straining, every driver exhausted. Men slept inside their tanks for warmth, the Maybachs idling through the night, guzzling what little fuel remained. Each startup in the morning risked a broken gear or a snapped track. The men joked darkly that the Tiger II didn't need an enemy, it killed itself just fine. Still, the myth of invincibility held. When a captured American POW was marched past a row of king tigers parked under the trees, he couldn't help but stare. The tanks looked like fortresses on treads, their angular armor glistening with frost. "How the hell do we stop those?" he muttered. A German guard smiled. "You don't." But beneath that confidence was fear. Mechanics whispered that several tanks had already seized their engines during the march. One had cracked its final drive, a fatal wound no field repair could fix. Another had thrown its track and sat half buried in the snow, abandoned until fuel could arrive. No one dared tell Piper. His temper was as legendary as his ambition. On December 18th at dawn, one of the lead king tigers roared to life and began climbing a hill outside La Glaise. The ground trembled. Its commander, Lieutenant Schultz, radioed back. "Proceeding, engine temperature rising." A minute later, his voice crackled again, strained, angry. "She's losing power." Then came a metallic snap that echoed through the valley. The tank lurched to one side, one track thrown off its wheels. Steam hissed from the engine deck. Schultz slammed his fist on the console. "Verdammt, again!" The monster was crippled. The crew worked for hours in the freezing wind, cursing and sweating, trying to realign the track links with iron bars. The metal burned their gloves. The fuel lines froze. By nightfall, they gave up, leaving the king tiger squatting uselessly on the roadside, its gun silent, its might undone by its own weight. All around them, the forest swallowed the sound. The wind moved through the pines, like a whisper, not of triumph, but of irony. The greatest tank the Reich had ever built was already dying, and it hadn't fired a single shot.
Morning came to the Ardennes like a slow bruise. The forest that had seemed peaceful now echoed with engines, shouting, and the groan of gears straining against ice. The snow was still falling, thick, heavy flakes that muffled sound and swallowed distance. From the trees emerged the column of Joachim Piper's spearhead, crawling westward like a convoy of ghosts. At its heart rolled the steel monsters, the Tiger IIs, the pride of the German Panzerwaffe, and the burden of their own army. Each weighed nearly 70 tons. Each carried a cannon that could blast through a Sherman from 2 kilometers away. Each was supposed to be invincible. Yet already the illusion was cracking. Inside one Tiger II, the driver shouted over the roar of the Maybach HL-230 engine. "Oil pressure dropping!" "Keep going," his commander barked. "If I keep going, she'll seize. Then pray she doesn't." They did keep going, for another few hundred meters. Then came the dull, heart-sickening sound of metal tearing itself apart. A transmission gear sheared off, clanging inside its housing like a trapped bullet. The driver swore, smoke rising from the vents. The tank stopped. Its crew climbed out into the snow, faces gray with exhaustion and oil. The rest of the column rumbled past them, treads splattering mud and ice. No one stopped to help. Piper's orders were relentless. No delays. The Americans were regrouping. Speed was everything. But speed and the king tiger did not coexist. On the narrow roads of the Ardennes, the giants moved at the pace of crippled beasts. Their tracks cracked frozen asphalt. Their engines, tuned for open terrain, choked on the mountain climbs. At every village, bridges shuddered under their weight. One collapsed completely near Stumont, plunging a truck and several soldiers into the icy stream below. Piper watched from the roadside, his black SS coat dusted with frost. He didn't flinch. "Leave them," he said. "Push forward." By then, fuel was running low. Allied airstrikes and frozen roads had shredded the German supply lines. Convoys carrying gasoline never reached the front. Tank crews began siphoning from abandoned vehicles, from wrecks, from each other. A Tiger II burned through nearly 500 liters of fuel every 50 kilometers. The arithmetic was impossible. In one clearing near Trois Ponts, 3 king tigers sat idling while their crews argued in low voices. The senior sergeant, a veteran from Kursk, kicked the treads and shook his head. "She's a god, this tank, but a god that eats too much," he spat into the snow. "In Russia, the mud killed us. Here, it'll be our own machine." To the west, the battle intensified. American infantry and Sherman tanks were beginning to counterattack, emerging from the fog like ghosts of their own. The Sherman was lighter, weaker, but faster and far easier to repair. For every King Tiger that broke down, 10 Shermans could move to plug the gap. The Germans knew it. Still, they pushed on, faith and fear driving them in equal measure. On December 19th, near the village of Stavilo, Piper's column met resistance from the 30th Infantry Division. Artillery screamed through the trees. The first shells hit the road, throwing up fountains of snow and splinters. A Tiger II fired back, its 88mm cannon roaring like thunder, the shockwave shattering nearby windows. The shell tore through an American half-track, vaporizing it in a single explosion. For a moment, the old terror returned, the fear that no Allied weapon could match German engineering. But then, another King Tiger's engine caught fire. The driver had over-revved trying to climb a frozen slope. Flames licked through the rear grills, the crew bailed out, rolling in the snow, their black uniforms turning gray. The fire spread quickly, the tank's own oil feeding the blaze. The invincible machine burned for hours, its thick armor glowing orange, until the ammunition inside cooked off with a final hollow boom. Piper saw the fire from a hilltop and grimaced. "Damn these machines," he muttered. "They're lions with glass bones." The irony grew sharper with every mile. The Tiger II had been designed for open plains, where its massive gun could dominate at long range. But in the Ardennes, with its forests, tight roads, and constant hills, the monster's size was a curse. It couldn't maneuver, couldn't hide, couldn't retreat. Its armor meant nothing when it couldn't even reach the battlefield. By the night of December 20th, Piper's Kampfgruppe had lost nearly half its heavy tanks, not to enemy fire, but to mechanical failure. Some were abandoned in ditches, their tracks snapped, their transmissions locked. Others simply ran out of fuel and were blown up by their own crews to prevent capture. The snow concealed their carcasses like graves, only the long barrels of their 88s jutting up through the white. Meanwhile, Allied artillery tightened around them. Roadblocks appeared behind Piper's line of advance. Supply routes were gone. The offensive, the great gamble of the Reich, was stalling under its own weight. And still the King Tigers groaned forward, one tortured kilometer at a time. Private Thomas Keegan of the 30th Infantry Division didn't know their names or numbers. He only knew that something huge was coming through the forest. One night he and his squad heard the low rumble in the distance. Not thunder, not trucks, but something deeper. "Feels like the earth's moving," someone whispered. Then they saw the silhouette of a tank unlike any they had faced before, taller, wider, its cannon glinting in the moonlight. Jesus! What the hell is that thing? The tank rolled closer, unstoppable, until it hit a patch of black ice. Its treads spun, throwing up snow and dirt. The driver tried to reverse. The engine screamed, then stopped. Steam hissed from the vents. The tank went still. The Americans opened fire, not with shells, but with disbelief. They hadn't fired a shot, and the enemy's most powerful weapon had broken itself. Somewhere in the forest, another Tiger II died the same way, a monument to its own weight. Piper's men pushed on, slower and slower, dragging their invincible machines through the white wilderness. Every mile forward was another nail in their coffin. The Reich had built the greatest tank on Earth, but the Ardennes would prove it had also built its own downfall.
By December 22, 1944, the forest of the Ardennes had turned from a battlefield into a frozen tomb. The once unstoppable spearhead of Joachim Pieper's Kampfgruppe was running on fumes, literally. What had begun as Hitler's grand counterstroke into Belgium had slowed to a crawl the broken armor and men shuffling through knee-deep snow. The 1st SS Panzer Regiment had come within a whisper of the Meuse River, and then the fuel ran out. For the King Tigers, that meant death. La Glaise, a small Belgian village nestled between two icy ridges, became the final resting place of Pieper's armored column. The locals had already fled or hidden in cellars, the chimneys silent, the windows boarded. When the first German tanks rolled through the main street, the ground shook. 70-ton giants clanked between stone houses, their long guns sweeping side to side like the necks of prehistoric beasts. The snow melted beneath their exhaust. Inside one of them, Tank 213, the crew sat in silence. The driver, Unteroffizier Haller, fought the gears as the machine lurched forward. "The temperature's in the red," he shouted. The commander, Obersturmführer Hein Krieger, didn't answer. He was staring through his periscope at the blinding white of the road ahead, jaw clenched, eyes hollow from days without sleep. The Maybach engine coughed. Steam burst from the vents. The smell of hot oil filled the cramped metal coffin. "Keep it moving," Krieger hissed. "If we stop, we're finished." But outside, the world was already closing in. American artillery had begun to bracket La Glaise. Shells screamed through the trees, bursting on the ridge lines. Every road behind Pieper's column was now under Allied control. Bridges at Stavelot and Troyes-Ponce were gone. Supply trucks lay overturned in ditches, their fuel barrels riddled with holes. There would be no reinforcements, no retreat, no fuel. By nightfall, Pieper's force was trapped. Hundreds of men, dozens of tanks, surrounded by a tightening ring of American infantry and artillery. The snow kept falling, muffling everything except the distant rumble of battle. Inside the village, the King Tigers were parked nose to tail along the narrow streets, forming makeshift barricades. The massive 88mm guns pointed toward the approaches, black holes in the winter fog. From above, column looked like a trail of iron beasts frozen mid-charge. But the monsters were starving. One after another, the engines refused to start. The oil had thickened to sludge in the cold. Batteries were dying. Crews tried to light fires under the engines to warm them, only to risk igniting their own fuel lines. Mechanics crawled under the treads with hammers and torches, cursing through chattering teeth. Every clang echoed like a funeral bell. By midnight, Pieper gathered his officers in the cellar of a ruined house. Candles flickered over maps covered in fingerprints and coffee stains. The air stunk of kerosene and despair. "We're cut off," an adjutant said quietly. Pieper's blue eyes flashed. "Then we'll break out." "With what, Herr Standartenführer? We have no fuel, the Tigers. Then we burn what we can't use. But we will not surrender." The order spread like frost. Crews began draining the last drops of gasoline into the tanks that could still move. Others prepared their charges: thermite grenades, demolition blocks, Molotov cocktails. The King Tigers that had terrified entire divisions would now be sacrificed to their own flames. At dawn on December 23rd, the temperature plunged to 20 below zero. The sky was clear, and with it came the American fighter bombers. P-47 Thunderbolts screamed over La Glaise, their engines roaring, their wings flashing silver. Rockets streaked down into the village, smashing into walls and gardens. One struck near Tank 213, blowing open a nearby house and showering the machine in debris. The concussion jarred the crew inside. Haller's ears rang, his nose bleeding. "We can't stay here," he yelled. But there was nowhere to go. The fuel gauge needle sat at zero. When they tried to start the engine again, it turned once, twice, then seized. Steam rose from the vents like the breath of a dying beast. The King Tiger had thrown a track during the bombardment. Its right side sagged, steel links scattered across the road like bones. Krieger slammed his fist on the console. "Scheisse! She's done." He looked at his men, the gunner, loader, radio operator, their faces pale under the dim red light. "Out," he said at last. "Take your weapons, leave everything else." They climbed out into the frozen street, the tank looming behind them like a cathedral of iron. Krieger turned once, almost reverently, and placed a grenade on the engine deck. "You served well," he murmured. Then they vanished into the forest. The explosion came minutes later, muffled by snow. Peeper himself gave the same order across the village. One by one, the great machines were destroyed by their own crews. Engines shattered, guns spiked, hatches blown open. Flames flickered within their armor like candles in tombs. When darkness fell on Christmas Eve, L'Église was a graveyard of steel. The air smelled of fuel and ashes. The last remnants of Peeper's force slipped into the woods, leaving behind more than 30 tanks and hundreds of vehicles. They carried no supplies, no rations, and only a handful of rifles. Peeper's men would walk through the snow for days, hunted by American patrols, before reaching German lines. The next morning, silence returned. The smoke from the wrecks drifted slowly upward, staining the snow black. Among the ruins, one tank still stood almost untouched, its massive turret facing the road, its hull intact, the iron cross still visible beneath soot and frost. Tank 213. The mighty King Tiger, the machine meant to bring victory to the Reich, had died not by shell or bomb, but by its own weight, its own hunger, its own impossible perfection. Far away in American lines, soldiers were already hearing rumors. "There's a monster in L'Église," someone said. "Bigger than a house, still standing." They would find it soon enough. The engineers were coming, and they would be astonished by what they saw.
Christmas morning, 1944. The snow fell soft and slow over the ruins of L'Église, blanketing wreckage and corpses alike. For 2 days, the thunder of guns had rolled across these hills, and now, for the first time, the Ardennes was silent. The storm had passed. The Germans were gone. At dawn, the lead elements of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division moved cautiously into the village. The men were exhausted, half frozen, but the sudden quiet felt unnatural. Rifles were ready, safeties off. They expected an ambush behind every wall. Instead, they found ghosts. Sergeant Frank Delaney led the first squad down the main street. Houses were shattered, their walls blown open. Burned trucks lay on their sides, and there, looming above everything, was something none of them had ever seen. A tank. But not just any tank. It filled the road from one side to the other, its gun barrel stretching 20 feet into the mist. Its armor plates were warped from heat, yet unpierced. Frost clung to its iron skin like a second coat of paint. The German cross still gleamed faintly through the soot. "Jesus Christ," Delaney whispered. "What the hell is that thing?" Corporal Morgan circled it slowly, his boots crunching in the snow. "Looks like a tiger, but bigger." It was bigger, impossibly bigger. The Americans had fought tigers and panthers before, but this machine was monstrous. The name stenciled faintly on a panel confirmed it. Panzerkampfwagen Tiger Osv B, the King Tiger. The tank sat at the center of the crossroads, silent and still, its turret frozen mid-turn as if staring down an invisible enemy. Around it lay the carcasses of other vehicles, Panzer IVs burned to hulks, half-tracks flipped and abandoned. But this one stood intact, untouched. Delaney climbed onto the hull, his breath clouding in the cold. He ran a gloved hand along the armor. It was smooth and unbroken. No shell impacts, no holes. The war's deadliest tank surrendered not to battle, but to itself. He found the right side track blown apart, steel links scattered across the street like broken bones. The engine vents were blackened with soot. When he looked closer, he saw cracks in the gearbox housing and melted oil frozen solid in the cold. The giant had died of exhaustion. "Hey, Sarge," someone called from below. "You think it's booby-trapped?" Delaney shrugged. "Only way to find out." He tugged open the commander's hatch. It resisted, then gave with a shriek of frozen metal. A gust of foul air hit him. Oil, cordite, and something else. Something burnt. Inside, the walls were slick with soot. The crew had left in a hurry. Helmets and ration tins still littered the floor. The radio dangled by its wires. He dropped inside. The space was tighter than he expected, claustrophobic, stifling. He could still feel the ghost heat of the engine. On the console, a German manual lay half open, its pages stiff with frost. He wiped off the title, Betriebsanleitung für Panzerkampfwagen Tiger B. He stared around the interior, gears the size of his forearm, controls labeled in precise Gothic script, instruments etched with the care of a watchmaker. It was both beautiful and absurd, a cathedral built for destruction. Back outside, more soldiers had gathered. Soon engineers from the 463rd Ordnance Maintenance Battalion arrived with jeeps and cameras. Lieutenant Harold Foster, an armorer from Pittsburgh, climbed atop the tank and whistled softly. "My God," he said, "this thing's built like a battleship." They began examining it, taking photographs, sketching notes. Foster measured the armor thickness, 180 millimeters on the front. "No wonder we couldn't knock him out," he muttered. Then he rapped his knuckles on the steel. "But look at that transmission housing. She probably burned herself out before she ever fired a shot." An engineer opened an access panel and winced at the sight of shattered gears. "Overheated," he said. "You can see where the teeth sheared clean off. Hell, it's like putting a truck engine in a locomotive." Another found the Maybach HL-230's pistons fused solid. The cooling system had frozen. Oil lines were cracked. Everything about the machine screamed over-engineering. Brilliance turned self-destruction. By afternoon, a small crowd of American soldiers stood around the tank, marveling. Cameras flashed. Someone painted "Yanks Bag a Tiger," King Tiger, on the turret in white chalk. Another climbed up and posed, cigarette in mouth, helmet tilted just so. The photo would later appear in Stars and Stripes. "Yanks Bag a Tiger King." They had expected monsters. What they found was a monument to excess. Foster filed his report that evening. Tiger II recovered intact at La Glaise. Engine failure due to transmission breakdown and overheating. No evidence of combat damage. Enemy abandoned vehicle prior to engagement. Design complexity extreme, likely impractical for field conditions. When the news spread, engineers across the front were astonished. The Germans' greatest tank, the pinnacle of their war machine, had been defeated not by Allied firepower, but by its own mechanical limits. That night, as snow fell over the quiet village, Delaney and his men bivouacked near the ruined church. The King Tiger loomed just beyond the walls, its gun pointing skyward, collecting snow in its barrel. Under the moonlight, it looked less like a weapon and more like a fallen statue, a monument to pride and failure. The wind picked up, whistling through the shattered streets, and somewhere deep inside the tank, a frozen hatch creaked, a last groan from the monster that had conquered nothing. By morning, the engineers would be gone, hauling pieces of the machine back to study. But the shell of the beast would remain, a silent witness to the truth the battlefield had already decided. Strength without sense is weakness, and even steel can die of hubris.
Spring came late to the Ardennes. When the snow finally melted, the fields around La Glaise turned to mud, and from that mud emerged the rusted hulks of a defeated army. Sherman crews passing through in April stopped to stare at them. Dozens of burned-out panzers, their turrets split open, their engines torn apart. And among them, towering like a monument to a lost empire, stood Tiger II, number 213, the same steel giant the Americans had found that frozen Christmas morning. The war was ending. Hitler was dead. The Reich, that had once promised 1,000 years of triumph, was now measured in days. Yet this one tank remained, silent and whole, as if mocking both the victors and the defeated. In early May 1945, a team of U.S. Army engineers from the Ordnance Technical Intelligence Unit arrived at La Glaise. They had been ordered to recover advanced German technology for study: rockets, aircraft, engines, and tanks. When they saw the Tiger II, they simply stopped and stared. Lieutenant Harold Foster, the same engineer who had examined it months earlier, shook his head in disbelief. "She's still here," he said quietly, "and she still looks like she could eat a battalion." The villagers watched as the Americans swarmed around the tank. They brought cranes, winches, and flatbeds, measuring every plate, every rivet, every twisted cable. One sergeant tapped the side of the turret with a wrench and whistled. 200 millimeters of armor, he said. You could shoot a cannon at it all day and just make sparks. Foster nodded, but added, and that's the problem. They built a tank no road can carry and no engine can drive. When the engine deck was pried open, the engineers found the Maybach HL-230 frozen solid, its pistons fused to the cylinders. The cooling system had burst from the cold. A gearbox lay cracked in two, its teeth ground to glittering powder. Every component was a masterpiece of precision, and every one had failed. The Americans shipped parts of the tank back to the proving grounds at Aberdeen, Maryland. There, in the summer heat, the machine was taken apart like a myth laid on an operating table. Engineers in khaki uniforms studied the Maybach engine under fluorescent lights. Beautiful, one muttered, running a finger along the machined edges. But you'd need a miracle to keep this thing running in the field. They found the transmission so complicated it required 2 men just to shift properly. Bearings burned out after a few hours of operation. The cooling fans, designed for temperate climates, couldn't handle the deep cold of the Ardennes or the heat of the steppe. The report they filed was clinical but damning. Tiger II represents the pinnacle of German engineering excess. Excellent armor and firepower rendered ineffective by impractical design, excessive weight, and chronic mechanical fragility. The tank's failures are inherent to its ambition. When news of the captured Tiger II reached Detroit, American tank designers at Chrysler and Ford studied the photos with fascination. They admired the gun, the optics, the precision welding, but they shook their heads at the rest. Too much tank for any war, one said. Even German engineers captured after the surrender admitted as much. A former Henschel technician reportedly sighed, "It was never meant for war. It was meant for fear." Back in Belgium, the villagers of La Glaise refused to let their giant be scrapped. They towed it from the crossroads to the edge of town, where children climbed over its massive hull and tourists began to appear, soldiers from every nation wanting to see the beast that defeated itself. In time, it became the heart of the December 44 Museum, its long gun pointing toward the sky like a relic from another age. For the Americans who had first found it, the memory never faded. Sergeant Frank Delaney would later write in his journal, "We expected monsters, we found ghosts." That tank was like Germany itself, strong, beautiful, and doomed by its own pride. Private Thomas Keegan, years later, visited the museum with his grandchildren. The Tiger was still there, its paint faded, its armor pitted with rust. He touched the cold metal and remembered the night he'd first seen it through the snow, a shape too big, too perfect, too confident. "It never fired a shot," he told the guide. "Didn't have to. It was already beaten by what it was." The King Tiger remained. Seasons changed, snow and rain wore down its paint, but its legend grew. Historians debated its worth. Engineers dissected its flaws. Model builders worshipped its form. It became both a symbol of terror and a lesson in folly. In the end, the Tiger II was everything the Third Reich had been: immense, precise, terrifying, and unsustainable. Its armor was thick, but its foundations were brittle. Its power was real, but its endurance was an illusion. Today, when visitors stand before the tank in La Glaise, they see more than a weapon. They see a story cast in iron, the story of what happens when genius serves arrogance, when strength forgets humility, when a nation builds something so heavy that it crushes itself. On the plaque next to the tank, the inscription reads simply, King Tiger 213, abandoned December 24th, 1944. No Allied shell pierced it. No enemy destroyed it. It was undone by gravity, by friction, by the limits of its own perfection. And in that, it became immortal. The engineers who first stood before it had been right all along. The greatest tank of the Reich was defeated not by men, but by physics. The monster in the forest had conquered nothing except the myth of invincibility.